Good evening. Welcome to Dispatch Live. I'm David French, and I've got a great guest for you today. We're going to be talking to Brian Riedl from the Manhattan Institute, formerly for 6 years, the chief economist for Senator Portman from Ohio. Before that, Heritage Foundation lead research fellow on federal budget and spending policy. I'm reading that. I didn't have it memorized. And we're going to talk with Brian mainly about Joe Biden's debt relief plan. And we can also, have some other questions if you want to ask other questions about the economy. I mean, you're talking to the former lead economist for Senator Portman. I bet he's got some answers, and I might even have an extra question or two, Brian, if you don't mind.
Of course.
But let's start with student debt relief, and let's not start with the economic part of it. We were talking offline right before we got started that this has been a really emotional debate over the last 5, 6, 7 days. I was just reflecting that, I have written some things opposing his plan, and days of unrelenting hatred on Twitter. And I mean, I've had an occasional exposure to online dissatisfaction, shall we say. And this has been even on the higher end of that in some moments. Why? I mean, and we were talking, you noticed it as well. Why has this been so emotional, do you think?
Yeah, I mean, I usually work on dry budget issues, taxes, spending, Social Security. People have opinions on it, but they don't get to you on a gut level, moving it into a question of morality, ethics, and justice like they do with the student loan bailout. Mm-hmm. And I think, at least from my perspective as a critic, of the bailout, I think the bailout is seen as fundamentally unjust for 4 reasons. Mm-hmm. First, Americans generally believe that debts that are incurred through voluntary borrowing bring a moral commitment to repay the lender. You pay back your debts. That is an ethical, moral thing that people believe in, and they're proud of the fact that they repay their debts. Second, people believe in general that an individual or corporation that will profit from an investment should expect to pay for the investment yourself.
Right.
If you're going to collect $1 million in lifetime income for going to college, you're going to be the lead beneficiary. You should pay for it. Yes, there's going to be spillover effects of society, but the $1 million is going to you. You should pay for that investment. Third, people believe that any bailouts or government assistance should generally flow down the income ladder. And having welders and waitresses bail out college graduates, MBAs, JDs, doctors is also seen as very unjust. We're redistributing income upward. And then fourth, I think the fourth moral issue here is that many Americans believe that those who make responsible decisions, as Bill Clinton famously said, those who play by the rules should not be punished relative to the irresponsible. And forgiving student loans makes chumps and suckers out of people who paid back their loans, people who worked their way through college. In fact, some of the people who didn't go to college because they didn't think they could afford it. All of these individuals who prioritized being responsible feel like chumps and suckers because this subset of people who isn't paying back their loan or who can pay it back are getting a bailout that you are not. So for those 4 reasons, people feel greatly offended by the bailout, the critics do, on beyond just an economic level, but on a this is not fair level.
Well, what about the other side? I mean, I've been exposed to a lot of emotion from people who are quite supportive of student debt relief. What are you seeing as the reasons for their emotion?
I think that the people who are advocates, there's of course a self-interest angle. Nobody wants to pay back their student loans when there's other things that you want to spend your money on. But a lot of them also believe that they have been cheated by the high cost of college. A couple of years ago, there was a meme called Old Economy Steve, I believe it was. And it would talk about how these people in the 70s could go to college for a couple $100s, and then they could buy their first house cheap. And they had it so much easier. versus people today who are paying $100,000 to go to college, and then they graduate into a killer housing market. Childcare costs are through the roof. And what they will tell you is costs are higher for me today than they were for previous generations. I can't get ahead like previous generations could. And therefore, society has it in their best interest to help me get these debts out of the way so that I can be a contributor in the economy as well, just like old economy Steve was.
Right. So we talked offline also that rather than, because we agree with each other on this issue. I've written critically of the plan. You've written critically of the plan. So it would be kind of dull if we just both said to each other, great point. So let me take the position of the supporter of the plan, and let's stick with that point for a bit. And let me put on my hat that says this. Okay. Let's put all the old economy Steve aside for a minute. I'm sophisticated enough to know some of those numbers are really skewed. There was a Bernie Sanders economist who had a list of expenses that went viral that was just complete misinformation. Wages in the 1970s were not almost $900 a week. For example, he had listed wages at like $870 a week in 1970. But let me put it this way. In the information age, a college education is a prerequisite to full participation in the economy. And the cost of college education has dramatically risen above the rate of inflation. To participate fully in the economy, I need this college education. The rate of inflation, college has spiraled out of control. The costs have spiraled out of control. Add that to the fact that a lot of this debt is stuff that, say, I entered into when I was 17 or 18. Maybe I didn't have great parental guidance. You're talking about a kid really signing on the dotted line for massive debt. And let's be real. I mean, 10,000, the numbers actually are that the $10,000 debt relief, although the caps go up to, income of 125 or 250 for a married household, a disproportionate amount of that is going to accrue to the benefit of the people making well less than $100,000.
Yeah, I mean, those are all common points that I hear. I think if one thing I would caution is, we hear about how, well, this is really going to the middle class. The majority are earning under $75,000 a year who benefit. But it's important to look at lifetime income, because what a lot of individuals who might have very good degrees, lucrative degrees from top schools, might be making 50, 75, 100,000 now in their first couple of years after graduation. But 5, 10, 20, 25 years from now, these are going to be the educated elite of America. If you look at lifetime income, people who are doing very well are still going to get a big bailout. And that's one of the issues here with it not being targeted very well. A couple earning $250,000 a year can get up to $40,000 in bailout money. You're hitting doctors, lawyers, MBA business executives. So I do think there are hard cases at the bottom. There are particularly people who went to college but did not graduate, who have the student loan but don't have the degree. Those are hard cases. There are those who went to for-profit colleges that kind of became scams, who I think you could even get conservatives to agree should help. But there already are programs for these individuals. We already have income-driven repayment plans that cap monthly student loan payments for a lot of these people at a certain percentage of their discretionary income per month that's manageable, and that forgives it after a certain point. And so we do have programs in place for these people. But let's look at the student loan burden here. 2/3 of millennials have no student loan debt. Either they didn't go to college, they worked their way through college, or they paid it off. Of those who do graduate from college, the typical millennial graduates owing $30,000, which, if you assume a 4% interest rate and a 20-year loan, comes to $182 a month, about 4% of your income. That's annoying. It's not fun. It's a chunk of your income. It's not, it's survivable. It's really just the 4 or 6% of borrowers who are borrowing most of the money, who are owing $100,000 or more. But that's disproportionately MBAs, doctors, and lawyers. One other point I would make on, the sympathetic case for those who are dealing with escalating tuition is what the president has done does nothing to address the underlying issue of escalating tuition. It does nothing to stop universities from raising tuition and encouraging students to take out more loans. It does nothing about the fact that top private schools have endowments well into the billions. Some of these universities are essentially hedge funds with a little classroom instruction on the side.
Right.
I mean, if you actually want to end the cycle of borrowing and debt, you need to address the fact that, if anything, universities are going to raise their tuition even higher now and tell people to take out more debt. That's what we need to be addressing.
All right. So, let's just suppose for a moment that I agree with all of that. Let's hit another fairness issue. Okay. So we have seen multiple people who are in Congress, multinational corporations, businesses of real size that have just received a big loan from the government, PPP, and it's all been forgiven for them. And now I'm going to turn around and say, let's suppose, I belong to a nonprofit that received a $300,000 PPP loan that was forgiven. And then I'm going to turn around to Jane, the history major, who is a elementary school teacher in the Bronx, and say, sorry, you got to pay your $30K that's left over. I didn't, I just had my $300K forgiven. There's your $30K. You got to pay. It sounds a lot like the parable of the ungrateful servant in scripture, where the servant was forgiven much and then turns around and says to the person who owes him a little, too bad, so sad for you. Isn't there some hypocrisy here?
Yeah, I'm seeing a lot of that on social media. People say, well, big fat cat corporations got PPP loans forgiven. But PPP, first off, just for just explaining the policy, PPP was not really intended to be a loan. It was intended to be a grant, but it was structured as a loan just to make sure that essentially the recipients would fill out the paperwork and make sure that the money is going where it's supposed to. Essentially, PPP was a wage replacement program because the government shut down your job. The government actually committed a takings. It said, we're shutting down your business, essentially. We're shutting down your job, but that's not fair to your workers. So we're gonna make sure that your workers during the pandemic can still receive a salary, which is, I think, different from voluntarily going to college, making an investment, accepting a student loan, and then profiting $1 million off of that investment. I think essentially PPP should be thought of more as a roundabout way of doing unemployment benefits for people who were shut down by the government, rather than forgiving a loan that someone entered into as an investment, where, again, you're going to collect $1 million for it.
All right. So let me take off my Steel Manning hat for a second and just sort of ask a general question. Okay. It's pretty darn clear that college is more expensive, even when adjusted for inflation. Why?
Why is college more expensive? Because students are willing to pay it. First off, we've pushed kids to go to college for the last 20, 30, 40 years. We've told kids, if you don't go to college, you are a failure, which, by the way, is a terrible message out there, because there's a lot of people who are doing very well, who go to tech school, who do apprenticeships, who do become plumbers and electricians and do a lot. But we've told the kids, you have to go to college. Then we've told them the government will essentially make it affordable by pumping you up with Pell Grants and student loans, no matter what it costs. That essentially told universities, you get to charge whatever you want. You can jack up tuition 5, 8, 10% per year, and government is just going to fill up loans and grants on these kids in order to pay for it. There was a study by the Federal Reserve of New York a couple of years ago that determined that every time the government increases student loans or Pell Grants, universities raise their tuition in response enough to capture 60% of the aid. So essentially, we're funneling money through students to really get it to the universities. And the universities are basically making a killing on this, because as long as the universities are going to charge as much as students are able to pay, and the more students want to go to college, and the more the government says we're going to help you pay, they're going to increase the tuition. And it's really scandalous at a certain point, because again, a lot of these private schools are sitting on enormous endowments. They could afford to drastically cut tuition almost to zero at certain universities if they wanted. And it's also, I mean, it's unjust, because a lot of it too is not even going to better classroom instruction. A lot of it is going to middle management, university bureaucracy. We've all seen the articles about the massive bureaucracy and administrators. It's not like all this money is going back to benefit the students. In fact, a lot of these poor students, they're getting classes taught by underpaid adjuncts rather than real professors who are, getting paid in what they deserve. And so students are basically getting cheated, and the universities are doing very well.
So one question I have is, and I don't know if this has been definitively quantified. It feels like almost everything to do with colleges has been quantified somewhere. But, one of the things that I notice, I went to college, my freshman year was 1987. If you go to my college right now in 2022, Lipscomb University just enrolled a record class. It is unrecognizable from 1987 as far as a nicer campus, better facilities, incredible amenities, much better on every front, from athletic facilities to academic facilities to dining facilities. It's a fundamentally different experience. And that's the same it is with many private schools, with many state schools. So you don't have an apples to apples, 87 to 2022. They're not the same institutions. How much of the cost is really captured by these massive capital improvements, often that were driven by market necessity to attract students?
Yeah, so some of it has been. I think a lot of the money has been wasted on, like I said, middle management, administration, but they've also put money. I mean, I got my bachelor's at the University of Wisconsin, and all of this, they're building. When I was there in the late 1990s, they were building like crazy all over the University of Wisconsin. They were building a new business school. They were building new buildings. The little dorm that I lived in 1994, which was awful. It was a little tiny high rise, no cable TV, no air conditioning. It's nothing like the dorms they have today in Madison. They have such nicer. I feel frankly cheated. At the same time, when I went there, the in-state tuition was $3,000 a year in the late 1990s. It is drastically more today. And so we're pumping money into these universities. A lot of it's being wasted. Some of it is going to better facilities, better dorms. But I will say that I think some of the people who are really getting hurt is in terms of teaching. Universities are relying more on underpaying these adjuncts to teach and really paying them poverty wages rather than hiring tenure track professors and paying them what they deserve. So while they're getting all this money at university level, the use of underpaid adjuncts is both cheating the adjuncts and cheating the students. So unfortunately, the money is not all going where we want it to be.
All right. So, okay, it's all well and good to criticize this debt forgiveness plan. And I'll grant that it's not going to do anything about college costs. And we both agree college has become more expensive. Well, Mr. Riedl, what's your plan to make this all better? Because the one thing I know about the Biden forgiveness is it's making my life better. What's your plan?
I don't have the perfect solution here, but I do think what we can do is streamline the income-driven repayment programs. Right now, we have multiple programs that will help people who cannot pay their student loans, but there's multiple overlapping programs. They're very complicated. They're hard to get into. I think we need to streamline how we, making it easier for people below a certain income to make sure that they're not going to be bankrupted by their student loans. I think we could start to go after the universities themselves. As much as a low tax person as I am, I think taxing the endowments may have some place here. Again, these are hedge funds that teach on the side. We also have experimented with proposals that would actually hold universities themselves responsible for student loan defaults of their students, as a way to have universities incentivize their students to be more responsible with how much loans they take out, and also maybe push them into majors that are more realistic for them, rather than just trying to get as much money extracted from these students as possible. I do think you can do some degree of loan forgiveness, particularly for those who went to for-profit colleges that ended up being scams. For those who are really suffering, you could do low-level forgiveness, because here's an interesting note. Most of the people who default on student loans aren't the six-figure borrowers, because those are the people who usually are borrowing for good degree, for like a good lucrative degrees. Most defaults are people who owe less than $5,000. It's people who have low income, who have borrowed a little bit, didn't graduate, didn't get a job that paid very well, and now they're basically going bankrupt and unable to pay all of their bills. That's where most of the student loan defaults are coming from. You could address that with minor loan forgiveness. But I think ultimately, we also have to take a look at the college financing system at the federal level. Having massive Pell Grants and constantly rising student loans is just encouraging universities to raise tuition. And I think if we reined in how much essentially we will give in student loans, how much people will be eligible for, what students may find is that they're not priced out of colleges because of aid dropping relative to the current trend, but they might actually see tuition start to come down and the universities start to unlock some of their own assistance, because ultimately the universities still want to fill those seats. And if there's less resources out there for the students, maybe they'll raise tuition 3% instead of 9%.
So student loans used to be dischargeable in bankruptcy. Now they're not. What about a simple reform of making student loans dischargeable in bankruptcy again?
I think we can look into that. I think that's probably a good idea. I didn't recommend it in my answer yet, because frankly, I need to do more research on the pros and cons. You don't want to create incentive effects for people to overborrow on their student loans such that they then end up still pocketing the income later. But I do think it's at least worthy of looking into. And one thing that I had mentioned in my article in the Dispatch that I'm frustrated is, I wish Republicans were talking about all ideas like this. Republicans really have been AWOL on this issue for a long time. And it's not just a matter of producing a policy recommendation now that the president has put out his executive order. They should have been putting out these ideas for the past 12 months, laying the groundwork and creating a debate, because now waiting until after the president's already made the announcement, it's just not going to have the same effect. There's a lot that can be done out there on these issues from the conservative side, but conservatives have been somewhat AWOL on a lot of policies such as this.
Feels like we have a dynamic where a conservative will know, or a Republican will know, I need to oppose this. And then somebody says, well, what's your plan? Hold on, Googling real fast. Does Heritage have something? Does does Manhattan Institute have something?
Exactly. I think, this is my broader critique of Congress right now, that I think we are electing culture totems to Congress rather than lawmakers and policy people to Congress. And when you elect people based on them fighting the right cultural battles, and the cultural battles are important, don't get me wrong. I'm interested in the cultural battles too, but when you do it totally at the expense of people who can also write the economic policy agenda, write the domestic policy agenda, you lose something. And we're not electing people who are there to be wonks. We're electing what Jonah Goldberg calls a parliament of pundits, people who are more interested in getting on Fox News and MSNBC. This is stuff Republicans should have been doing and leading on for the last year or two, because the public is on their side. And, it's not just a matter of being Scrooge and saying we're not going to help these students. It's a matter of saying we will help those who were scammed by private colleges. We will support income-driven repayment, but we're also going to make sure the universities aren't making a killing on the back of these students. And we're going to make sure, plumbers, welders, and waitresses aren't paying for somebody's MBA from Harvard. That's a winning issue for the right. Yeah. And I wish they would be more active on it.
All right. So I'm going to go to a couple of questions here. Pete asks, and this is a good question, how much of this is just sort of patronage politics? I mean, feeding the blue segment, part of the base. You had college educated voters who really helped propel Biden to the White House. The Democratic coalition is now skewing much more college educated than it used to. And this is just sort of taking care of your people. How much of it is that versus sort of, hey, I've looked at the economics of all this and it just makes all the sense in the world?
It's absolutely patronage. It's interesting, the Democrats talk so much about inequality and poverty, but they are elected by suburban professionals on the coasts. The professional class finances and elects Democrats, and ultimately they're becoming the party of the upper middle class. And we're seeing this on all sorts of issues. Their obsession with bringing back the state and local tax deduction, their focus on student loan forgiveness, free college. Meanwhile, the Republicans are becoming the populist working class party, which is more interesting. Yeah. And that's affecting Republican economics as well. But this is absolutely patronage. I wonder how much of student loan forgiveness is simply driven by the fact that the staffers on the Hill, on the campaigns, and in the White House are personally paying back student loans. There was a Jeff Stein article in the Washington Post this weekend, how Biden was convinced to go big on student loans. President Biden didn't want to be very aggressive on this until all of the former Elizabeth Warren staffers who are currently working in the White House made a big push and talked about their own student loans. And that convinced President Biden to go big. One thing you could say is, why aren't we forgiving medical debt? Medical debt is a huge burden for families. Well, because if you're a Democratic campaign staffer, you're focused on your student loan.
Yeah, that's absolutely fascinating. And it's also that part of the dynamic on Twitter. That is a younger skewing social media outlet, heavily college educated, disproportionately progressive, as you've noted on Twitter in the past. And so I feel like sometimes when you're talking about the student debt forgiveness conversation on Twitter, it's like joining into a hedge fund group me celebrating the preservation of the carried interest loophole. Like this is
their base. This is their people. Yeah, this is exactly. And all their complaints about Republican tax cuts are just paying off Republican voters and donors. Well, student loan forgiveness even Nate Silver admitted student loan forgiveness is just patronage politics for Democrats too. Patronage politics.
All right. So Phil asks, if adjuncts are underpaid, where's the money going?
That's what I would like to know. A lot of it is going to middle management. The ratio of administrators to professors in universities has skyrocketed over the years. If you just go to a university website, the number of new provosts and executive vice presidents and managers and coordinators and diversity teams, and it's enormous. There's a massive bureaucracy. There's also, as you mentioned earlier, there are capital investments going on. They're actually giving dorms that aren't the crime against humanity that you and I probably were dealing with before the turn of the century. And a lot of it too, at least again with private universities, is they're running surpluses. They're hoarding money and they're investing it and they're doing very well. Public universities, they don't have it quite as easy. In fact, some states are reducing aid gradually to public universities. My own state of Wisconsin had a 10-year tuition freeze at the public universities under Scott Walker. Not all of them are swimming in cash, but they're certainly collecting a lot more from tuition based on these policies.
So Brian asks, has some other ideas in addition to some of the ones that you mentioned about loan reform. minimum graduation rates to be in the loan program. Here's one I think is interesting: requirement to spend X percentage of your endowment each year on financial aid for students. That's a good question. To me, that's a really good question about these endowments. What is the value of taxing them versus regulating them? In other words, saying, Harvard, you have an endowment that's larger than the GDP of many countries. Once you're crossing a particular threshold, a certain amount of this just has to go to student aid. What's your thought on along those lines?
Yeah, I think there are trade-offs. I mean, generally, as a conservative, my first instinct is regulate them and make them reinvest the money into the university. And because I don't want it to go through Washington and go through politicians and have them get their grubby hands on it. If there's an argument for taxing it, it's that most of the endowments are held by a small subset of universities. And for them, reinvesting it into the university just means, great, Harvard becomes cheap, Princeton becomes cheap. That doesn't help somebody at a public school with tuition rising. And you could kind of spread the wealth a little bit more to the universities that don't have the endowments. But at the same time, personally, I just don't trust politicians having this money go to Washington. I don't trust that they're going to give it back and spend it wisely. And so my first instinct is there absolutely should be some sort of requirement. If you're going to participate in the student loan program, if you're going to get federal benefits, if you're going to have a relationship with the federal government, you can't essentially hoard the money and then maximize your student loans that are being sent and funneled into your school. Having minimum requirements for graduation, for how many students default on their student loans who graduate from your university, I think that should all be part of the discussion.
Another question, then we'll get to some of just some good old rank punditry, as Jonah says. So another question is, if we're talking about cost of college, how much are we blaming state governments for not stepping up and funding state college systems? There are some state colleges, for example, that only now receive a very small percentage of their total funding is coming from state budgets. The lion's share is tuition and donations, private donations. Yeah. How much are state governments fumbling the ball here?
It's really state by state. There are some states that are generous. Like I said, my example is Wisconsin, because that's a state that I know. They did a 10-year tuition freeze, and they funded that in part by having the state become much more generous, at least especially in the first 5 to 7 years of this, with its aid to the University of Wisconsin system. They also raised money through outside creative options. They did a lot of fundraising. Tommy Thompson came back and took over the UW system and was raising a lot of money. Other states, some of them cut off aid directly, significantly, at the end of the Great Recession about 10 or 12 years ago. States were really in deep trouble, and aid to universities really dropped, and it started to grow again towards the end of the decade. But yeah, I mean, to a certain degree, state governments might be telling themselves, look, if the alternative model is we just raise tuition and let the federal government hike up student loans and Pell Grants, the state government can essentially offload their costs onto the federal government, using these poor students as a go-between and having them pay it back. And I think there's a bit of that. As long as Washington is going to commit to the spending, states are really going to have an incentive to maybe not fund their public universities as much and just lean on the federal government to student loan these people up into funding the universities.
Well, here in Tennessee, bright red state, no state income tax. We have free community college. It's called Tennessee Promise. So you have 2 year, you can get an associate's degree, but it also gives you 2 years free head start on your college education, because those are transferable credits. Then we have Hope scholarships, lottery funded. Don't love that. But the combination of Tennessee Promise and these Hope scholarships means that in my very red state, it can be quite affordable. And so the average loan debt in Tennessee is substantially lower than the national average loan debt. So how much of this is something where you, as a John Q. citizen, instead of looking at Washington, move to your state house and say, what are you guys doing? How much of this is really more state than federal?
Yeah, I think states have a role in this, and I think states not only have a role in terms of how much they want to fund these programs. And it's interesting that Tennessee funds it by the lottery, because that's the big thing. Is on the one hand, you could say, well, that's terrific of Tennessee, because they're essentially not having the federal government do it all through student loans, but then they're doing it through a lottery, which a lot of people have ethical issues with, because that's going to create its own issues. But the other reason states have a responsibility here is because the states are the level of government that actually oversee the administration of the colleges. State legislatures do more than just write checks to universities. They run the universities, and they can impose rules and regulations and mandates in terms of how that money is spent. They can streamline the universities. They can run the state system much more than the federal government can. The federal government is really limited in its ability to regulate state universities. They do, they do indirectly finance the universities through the student loans, but the legislatures and the governors have that direct control to rein in these out of control universities. They have the power. They need to use it.
All right, so rank punditry time.
Okay.
Is this going to help the Democrats or hurt the Democrats in 2022?
I think it's going to hurt the Democrats, because in part, I don't think it gains them a lot of votes. I think the people who are benefiting from this were already engaged and were already going to vote Democrat. But I think a lot of conservatives are mobilized right now by this. It's helping mobilize the right a little bit more. The little pump of energy the Democrats seem to get from the abortion decision is kind of might be matched by a little bit more energy on the right on the student loan. And I do think if you want to see the politics of the student loan and how it's working against Democrats, take a look at the purple state Democrats running for Senate this year. They're running away from it. Tim Ryan in Ohio, running against J.D. Vance, said he opposed this. He opposed the president's plan. Senator Bennett in Colorado, running for re-election, said that he had lobbied the White House to streamline the plan, make it smaller, and only give it to lower income students. The fact that purple state Democrats are running away from this is really all the barometer you need to know that this is not considered a political winner this year for Democrats.
Yeah, it does seem the purple state Democrat is the bellwether. Now, Raphael Warnock in Georgia seemed to wrap his arms around the plan, but there's some preliminary polling, I mean, who knows, that indicates that it's not really redounding to his benefit.
Right.
But it seemed to me, and I wanted to ask you this because it just seemed to me to be kind of an own goal for Biden in a way, because he had some momentum. He had arrested the slide of his approval rating. He had achieved some legislative wins. But let's talk about one other aspect to this, and then we'll get into some more general macroeconomic stuff. The cost. This is a giant pile of money. I've seen estimates as high as $1 trillion, as low as 300 billion. Let's just call it 500 billion. This is eating up a large chunk of the alleged savings from the Inflation Reduction Act, isn't it? I mean, how costly is this, and what's the consequence, say, for inflation?
Yeah, I mean, the Inflation Reduction Act, I mean, the funny thing about the cost of all of this is the president signs a $280 billion semiconductor bill. Then he does a veterans bill that could cost up to $600 billion. Then they pass an Inflation Reduction Act that would save about 150 or 200 billion. And then they brag, see what deficit reducers we are, ignoring the fact that they had just done nearly $1 trillion in new deficits right before. And now on the flip side, on the other side, this is going to be about $500 billion for student loan forgiveness, which is on top of $300 billion the federal government has already spent allowing people to defer their student loans ever since the pandemic began. So you're really looking at, the neighborhood of $1 trillion in student loan spending on the side of the veteran spending and the semiconductor bill. It's really enormous. So as for inflation, I mean, the sad news is the Inflation Reduction Act was never going to reduce inflation anyway. The Congressional Budget Office said it's not going to reduce inflation. Penn Wharton did analysis that it's not going to reduce inflation. However, the student loan forgiveness is going to increase inflation. By how much is really tough to estimate, but I'll give you one estimate. Jason Furman, who was chief economist in the Obama White House, estimated that it will bump up the inflation rate about 0.3 points, which means that the typical family will cost about $200 in higher prices in the short term as a result of this bill. So as a result of this executive action. So you're getting no inflation reduction from the Inflation Reduction Act, but you are hitting families with a $200 cost of inflation from this executive action. And the second order effect is, by having higher inflation, the Federal Reserve is going to have to hit the brakes on the economy a little bit harder than otherwise. They're going to have to raise interest rates a little bit higher than they were already going to, which means you're going to have an effect of more job losses, and the risk of a recession modestly increases, just because the more Biden and Congress hits the gas pedal on inflation, the harder the Fed has to hit the brake pedal. And the only way they can hit the brake pedal is by putting us into a recession, essentially.
Right. Okay. So inflation we have the great inflation talking points debate of 2022, which is, okay, if the rate of inflation is, if costs are higher year over year, you've had inflation. But if the rate of inflation month to month has not increased, then we've leveled off. Where are we on inflation right now, Brian?
Inflation is up about 7% over the past year. We did not have any inflation last month. Now, what that means, it doesn't mean that the inflation went back down. It doesn't mean we undid everything that happened. It means that if something was $1 a year ago, it jumped up to $1.07. And last month, it didn't rise further. It stayed at $1.07. That's what we're at right now. It's not dropping back down to $1 anytime soon. And that's the danger for families, is even if we defeat inflation, even if inflation drops down to, say, 2%, you still had a 9% growth over a 12-month period. And most people probably didn't get a 9% raise in their job, which means you're still going to be behind, and we're not going to undo those effects.
Not to pop quiz you, but do you know off the top of your head the gap between inflation and wage increases? How much? Yeah,
real wages are down about 4.5% over the past year, which is really remarkable, because real wages typically rise maybe 1% per year. Some years they don't rise at all. Real wage growth happens very slow. So when you have it drop 4.5%, that's going to take years just to get back to where we were. It's significant.
All right. So let me ask you this. How much of this is Bidenflation versus how much of this was just baked into the cake after years of free money, after giant COVID expenditures to try to keep the economy going in the middle of a pandemic? Was any president going to be in this position, or did Biden make it worse? And if so, how much worse?
The answer is both. We were going to have inflation no matter what, because the Federal Reserve pumped $4.5 trillion into the economy during the pandemic. And I don't want to say that was a bad idea. The economy had been stopped, and the Federal Reserve was trying to keep us from going into a depression. But they hit the printing press hard, about $4.5 trillion in new printing, a lot of which then made its way into the unemployment benefits, the child tax credit, PPP. As a result, disposable income soared by about $2.5 trillion higher than where it would have been otherwise. It took a little while for the economy to reopen, and then all of that pent-up disposable income poured into the economy. That was always going to create inflation. That was probably going to get us to about 4 or 5% inflation. The way the Biden administration made it worse is, right after the economy reopened, when there was no longer a stopped economy that needed the dollars, they did a $1.9 trillion American Rescue Plan.
Right.
At that point, the output gap was only $420 billion. The economy was already reopened. So they shot a $1.9 trillion bazooka at a $420 billion output gap. At the same time, they added all this demand in the economy at a time when supply chains were still constrained. So you have all this new demand at the same time you have limited supply. And that's why the American Rescue Plan, to a degree, poured gasoline on the fire. And then on top of it, you have tariffs, you have expanding Davis-Bacon, Buy America rules, which you have oil and gas limitations, the student loan moratorium. The Biden administration really has made it worse, but we shouldn't pretend that there would have been no inflation. All that money from the Federal Reserve was eventually going to spill out anyway. But I think we probably would have leveled off closer to about 5% inflation, according to a study from the Federal Reserve of San Francisco. Instead, we bumped up to about 9.5% at its peak.
Gotcha. Okay. So let's suppose President Biden calls Rob Portman and says, I'm struggling here, man. Who you got that can advise me? Because my current group, they created this Bidenflation. And Senator Portman says, I got this former chief economist named Brian, and you're heading over to the White House. What are you telling the president of the United States to do or to ease our inflation crisis or avoid recession? Or is it even possible to actually really truly avoid recession and ease the inflation crisis? Or some would say we're in a recession now. Does it have to get worse before it gets better?
I would explain to them that the Federal Reserve is going to have to do most of the work stopping inflation. They're going to have to raise interest rates. However, the question is, do you want fiscal policy, regulatory policy, Congress, the White House to make it easier or harder for the Federal Reserve? The more we can do from a congressional level and a presidential level to ease inflation, the less the Federal Reserve has to do. And we can ease inflation in a pro-growth way. Stop the spending for the first angle. Mm-hmm. Stop passing huge spending bills. In fact, try to reduce federal spending. Open up more oil and gas. Increase the permits there. Tariffs. The Peterson Institute for International Economics says a 2 percentage point reduction in tariffs could reduce inflation enough to save each family $300 a year. Pull back the tariffs. Again, end the student loan moratorium. Open up the ports. We have the ports in California are still so backed up, in part because of union rules that limit the use of technology and the number of people who can work. Open up the ports. Pull back Davis-Bacon, which forces the government to pay prevailing wages that are often well above market level. Pull back Buy America rules. Why is the federal government buying higher priced inputs than they have to at a time of inflation? There's so much more we can do. There's ethanol rules that the Biden administration just tightened. Ethanol rules that's raising prices. Pull back the ethanol rules. If you do all this, you're not going to solve inflation, but you could even get it down, say, 3 points lower. And that means because you've done those 3 points in a pro-growth way, there's a lot less that the Federal Reserve has to do by pushing the brake pedal on the economy. You might get the soft landing. Now, the reason President Biden's not doing a lot of this, most of the stuff I mentioned would anger labor unions. Tariffs, Buy America, the ports, Davis-Bacon, those are all labor issues. And President Biden isn't ready to cross big labor. And that's why he's making inflation worse.
Okay. Are we also in a world, though, now where parts of the Republican Party aren't going to buy into that as well? Tariffs?
Yeah.
The Buy America rules. It was interesting because as you were talking, I was thinking I was having flashbacks to a kind of a Republican Party of yore. And I was And I was trying to think, okay, what's thumbs up about what you said and what's thumbs down
Yeah.
in the Republican Party of today? And it strikes me that there's no neat constituency for the plan that you just laid out.
That's right. That's right. Because as we mentioned earlier, the Republican Party has become more populist. It's become more working class. The party of Paul Ryan is gone. This is now the party closer to Donald Trump on economic policy, which means it's more comfortable with spending. It's even comfortable with taxing the rich and corporations. It's tariffs, regulations. It's also, the Republicans are becoming much more of a pro-union party. There's a lot of, the J.D. Vance kind of approach is kind of becoming a little more widespread. And so when I talk about things like when I talk to members of Congress, I talk to senators, I talk to staff on the Hill, and I mention things like Davis-Bacon, and Buy America, tariffs. They say, I don't know. In fact, you have, again, in Wisconsin, Ron Johnson running ads, bragging about being tough on China. And nobody wants to be accused of being weak on China. And so you kind of have a little bipartisan push for things like tariffs. And, well, this is the inflation we all signed up for.
Yeah. Yeah. Now the interesting question to me is, all right, well, we hold certain economic ideas because we think they're not because we're particularly attached, say, to Paul Ryan as a person, although I have no beef with Paul Ryan as a person, but because, and I'm not ascribing to you Paul Ryan's economic ideas. I'm just using him as a symbol of a Republican Party of your. We hold particular views because we think that they're actually these are the best views to contribute to a flourishing economy. What does an economist without a constituency do? How do you push the levers of public opinion when you don't have the engine of a party behind you in the same way that you used to?
How do I do it?
I would just, here's some just free advice for young aspiring economists.
Oh boy. Yeah, I mean, I have to say I'm a free market economist, and I can't find a good free market party to listen to me on much of any of this. There used to be a free market party. Now there's two populist parties. What I'm trying to do is I'm still writing articles, writing op-eds, I'm tweeting out data, trying to win people over with facts. But I'm also kind of biding my time under the belief that because I believe my economic policies are correct, I think eventually we will come back to them because we won't have much of a choice. Right. I think ultimately failed economic policies will fail. I write a lot on runaway spending and deficits. I believe it's unsustainable. And at a certain point, lawmakers will come back to the solutions I propose because it's unsustainable. Huge tariffs, huge regulations, inflation driving policies are unsustainable and hurt working class individuals. And you have to have faith that at a certain point that will become evident. And what you want to do is write the studies now so that when the things do happen and they do need your solutions, you're ready to go, and hope that someday, they'll come back to you.
I'm reminded of, I don't know if you ever grew up or continue to watch professional wrestling.
When I was a kid. Yeah.
I had the joy of seeing Jerry the King Lawler wrestle Tojo Yamamoto and Rupp-Arena in Lexington, Kentucky in elementary school. And then when I was deep into college, saw Hulk Hogan take on Randy Macho Man Savage. Ooh. That's how long my fandom.
That's my generation of wrestlers.
Yeah. So I precede you. I was your contemporary. I followed Dwayne The Rock Johnson when he was, wielding the people's elbow. So I'm kind of conversant in wrestling lingo. And what you're saying reminds me of, there's these dramatic moments where the announcers will go, wait a minute, there's this melee in the ring. And then they'll say, wait a minute, is that the Undertaker's music? And then you'll hear music and out comes a wrestler. Yeah. So what you're saying is, when the economy gets bad enough, somebody's going to say, wait a minute, is that Brian Riedl's music? And you're going to come out with the plan.
Well, if I can brag about my ability to see what's coming at a certain point. I wrote a big report last December about the idea that interest rates may not stay low forever.
Yeah.
And what's going to happen to the national debt if interest rates rise? Because we basically have borrowing all this money on the assumption that the interest rate stays low forever. And when I put out this report, I was mocked all over Twitter by economists who said interest rates will never rise again. They have been permanently defeated. You're an idiot. And lo and behold, 9 months later, rates are rising. And so it's important to, be ready with the report so that when the Undertaker music does come on, I'm ready to run out with my calculator.
Yeah. Well, it sounds like between you and Larry Summers, where do you go to get your apologies? Because he was out saying, hey, wait a minute, inflation is going to be an issue.
Yeah.
And was roundly derided and mocked as well.
He was there. It was really nasty. And also to a certain degree, Jason Furman has been sounding the warning on a lot of this, and they get so much hate. The sad thing is they're still not going to be forgiven. That's the way politics works. Usually the person who warns everybody ahead of time usually does not get the wonderful apology they deserve later. But you know what? I'm in it just to try to make things better. I'm not really worried about getting credit. But I do think issues like, interest rates rising and how that's going to affect the debt are serious issues. And I'm glad that the research is out there to warn people as things get worse.
And hey, we at the Dispatch know you're right. So that's got to.
I don't have a party, but I have the Dispatch to at least kind of be as close to a party as I can.
There you go. The remnant, right, to borrow Jonah's term. So
exactly.
Well, thank you very much. You have made a difficult issue quite accessible. And thank you. You wrote, and when we post this online, we'll need to put your article, your piece you wrote for the Dispatch in our show notes. So tell people how to follow you.
Sure. You can follow me on Twitter, Brian_Riedl, Riedl. You can also find me at the Manhattan Institute. If you just Google Brian Riedl, BrianRiedl, Manhattan Institute, there is hundreds of articles and studies.
And now, correct me if I'm wrong, one very last thing, and I could be misremembering this, but I think you have one of the more memorable tweets that I have used and I think it's yours, that I have used many times to describe what Twitter is.
Yes.
And so if you could share that analogy used between, Vermont and Hawaii, what is Twitter as a community?
Oh boy, I'm trying to remember the exact numbers I use. If Twitter were I think Twitter overall, if it were a state, it'd be D+15. Which would make it like Vermont. And it would also, if the people who engage the most on Twitter have the same voter profile of the second most liberal congressional district in America. So essentially, the argument you see on Twitter, the profile of who's arguing politics on Twitter matches the political ideology of the #2 Democratic district in America. And that's why the discussion on Twitter is so twisted and biased and not reflecting real America. And that's why lawmakers and reporters should use it as a barometer at their peril.
Yeah, I have used it. I've used that exact tweet and those exact statistics to argue overwhelming. And for the right, it says you're just losing. It's the end. It's doom and gloom. And neither is true. Neither is true.
Exactly. When I'm on Twitter, I feel like, oh my gosh, the progressive movement is dominating. Elizabeth Warren is the center of American politics. Half the people are to the left, half of the people are to the right of Elizabeth Warren. I feel like my side is never going to win an election again. But then, sometimes on election nights, you see it's not really that way.
Yeah. People actually vote and they don't vote the way Twitter likes. So
exactly.
Fascinating stuff. Thank you, Brian. Really appreciate it. Thank you, listeners. Thank you for your questions. And we'll be back next week.
Thank you.